7 levels of stupidity that destroyed Russia. What you're about to see are the 7 levels of strategic stupidity that destroyed Russia from within. Each one more reckless, each one more irreversible, each one a step deeper into collapse. Let's begin. Level 1. Imperial delusion. Putin called the Soviet Union's collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Not the Holocaust, not 2 world wars, the end of his empire. That obsession became Russia's first fatal mistake. Moscow convinced itself that sheer size equaled power. 11 time zones, about 6,000 nuclear warheads, a permanent UN Security Council seat. On paper, Russia looked unstoppable. But here's the reality nobody in the Kremlin wanted to hear. By 2017, Russia's entire economy was roughly the size of Italy's, around $1.5 trillion, smaller than South Korea, barely ahead of Spain. A nation trying to play superpower on a middleweight budget. And the cracks were already showing. Russia's population wasn't growing, it was dying. Birth rates had collapsed, life expectancy for men was hovering around 68 years, comparable to developing nations. Each year, Russia was losing hundreds of thousands of people to demographics alone. The workforce was shrinking, the young were leaving, the old were overwhelming the system. But Putin didn't see decline, he saw destiny. His inner circle fed him exactly what he wanted to hear. Intelligence reports painted rosy pictures, military briefings exaggerated Russian strength. When advisors raised concerns, they were sidelined or silenced. Truth became the enemy. Putin surrounded himself with yes-men who understood one rule: never contradict the boss. A government making decisions based on fantasy, not facts. They believed fear alone could replace genuine power. That intimidation could substitute for economic strength. That nuclear threats would compensate for a military hollowed out by corruption. Russia spent decades convincing itself it was still a colossus. That neighboring countries trembled at Moscow's shadow. That the West was weak and divided and would never stand together against Russian aggression. Every assumption was wrong. But this wasn't the worst part, because Putin didn't just believe his own propaganda, he acted on it. This delusion didn't just breed overconfidence, it lit a fuse that would detonate everything. Level 2. The Ukraine Gamble. February 24th, 2022. Russia launched what Putin called a special military operation. He expected it to last 3 days. Russian intelligence had assured him the Kiev would fold immediately. The FSB had sent agents into Ukraine months before preparing for Moscow's arrival. They told collaborators to prepare your armaments for our officers. They genuinely believed Ukraine's government would flee and the population would welcome Russian troops. Some Russian units literally packed dress parade uniforms, not ammunition, not winter gear, uniforms for the victory march through Kiev that was supposed to happen within 72 hours. They thought it was another cargo ship. Then Ukraine fought back. President Volodymyr Zelensky didn't run. He stayed in Kiev, turned down evacuation offers, and told the world, "I need ammunition, not a ride." That single decision shattered Russia's entire plan. Within days, the mighty Russian war machine started looking like a rusted-out relic. A massive 40-mile convoy of tanks and armored vehicles sat paralyzed on a single highway north of Kiev for weeks. Ukrainian forces picked them off one by one, equipment broke down, soldiers ran out of fuel, food, and morale. Elite Russian paratroopers were slaughtered trying to seize Hostomel Airport. The assault on Kiev collapsed. By the end of March 2022, Russian forces were retreating from northern Ukraine in complete chaos, abandoning equipment and bodies in their wake. The Blitzkrieg had failed, but Putin had another miscalculation waiting. He assumed the West would fracture, that Europe would bicker, that sanctions would be weak and temporary, just like in 2014. He was catastrophically wrong. Within weeks, the United States, France, Germany, UK, Japan, Canada, and Austria froze about $300 billion of Russia's foreign reserves. Major Russian banks were kicked out of SWIFT. Western companies fled by the hundreds. Germany cancelled the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and started sending weapons to Ukraine. Even neutral Sweden and Finland rushed to join NATO. Finland's accession doubled NATO's border with Russia overnight. Putin had gambled everything on a quick victory, on a weak Ukrainian response, on a divided West. He lost all 3 bets at once. And here's where the stupidity compounded. Retreat was now politically impossible. Admitting failure would mean the end of Putin's grip on power. so instead of cutting losses, he doubled down. The special operation turned into a full-scale war. Mobilization, martial law, total commitment to a campaign that had already failed in its first week. But the real horror wasn't the failed blitz, it's what Putin did next. Level 3. Military self-consumption. Russia began devouring itself. When the quick victory didn't happen, the Kremlin did what it always does: throw more bodies into the meat grinder. The casualties are staggering. As of late 2025, UK intelligence estimates over 1.1 million total Russian casualties. The Center for Strategic and International Studies put deaths alone at around 250,000. Russia has lost more soldiers in Ukraine in 3 years than the Soviet Union lost in a decade in Afghanistan, possibly more than all Russian and Soviet wars combined since 1945. Independent Russian media have confirmed by name over 163,000 dead soldiers as of January 2026. Real people, real families mourning. And those numbers don't capture the full horror, because not everyone died equally. Moscow made the calculated decision: shield the capital and major cities by sending ethnic minorities and soldiers from poor regions to die first. Buryatia, a remote Siberian region with less than 1 million people, suffered some of the highest per capita death rates. Dagestanis, Tuvans, and other minorities were dying at rates 3 times higher than soldiers from Moscow. The empire was using its colonized people as cannon fodder. Russia's mobilization in September 2022 triggered the largest exodus since the 1917 revolution. Hundreds of thousands of military-aged men fled the country rather than be sent to Ukraine. They crossed into Georgia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, anywhere to escape the draft. Russia was hemorrhaging exactly what the people it needed most: young, educated men in their prime working years. But the losses weren't just human. Russia was burning through its military hardware at pace not seen since World War II. By January 19, 2026, Russia had lost almost 24,000 armored vehicles, thousands of tanks destroyed or captured. To replace them, Moscow started pulling 1950s-era T-54 and T-55 tanks out of storage, museum pieces that were already obsolete when John F. Kennedy was president. The sight of these ancient relics on the modern battlefield told you everything. Russia's modern armored force was gone. Then there was the Black Sea Fleet. Once the pride of Russian naval power, it became a national humiliation. In April 2022, Ukraine hit the flagship Moskva, a guided missile cruiser, with 2 Ukrainian-made Neptune anti-ship missiles. The Moskva sank into the Black Sea, becoming the largest warship lost in combat in decades. But it didn't stop there. Over the next year, Ukraine systematically hunted Russia's fleet with drones, missiles, and special forces. Landing ships blown up in ports, patrol boats destroyed, submarines damaged. By 2023, Russia had quietly evacuated most of its valuable ships from Crimea to ports further east out of Ukrainian range. A country with no navy had neutralized Russia's entire Black Sea Fleet. The fleet that was supposed to dominate the region was hiding in port, too scared to operate. Every tank destroyed, every ship sunk, every soldier killed. These weren't just battlefield losses, they were irreplaceable pieces of Russia's future military power. And the worst part? Putin kept feeding more into the fire. While Russia bled its military dry, something even more dangerous was rotting from within. Level 4. Elite and system breakdown. By the second year of the war, the Russian state wasn't just losing in Ukraine, it was losing the ability to face reality. The Kremlin's solution to every problem became the same: crush the truth instead of fixing the problem. Russian state media painted a fantasy. Defeats were tactical regroupings, retreats become gestures of goodwill, Ukrainian casualties were inflated to absurd levels while Russian losses went unmentioned. The Ministry of Defense claimed they'd destroy more Western weapons than Ukraine even had. It was a total information blackout, not from the West, but from reality itself. This created a vicious cycle. Bad news couldn't reach the top, so bad decisions kept getting made. Incompetent commanders stayed in place, logistics remained broken. Russia created a system where lying became the only way to survive. Meanwhile, corruption metastasized. Defense contractors delivered shoddy equipment and pocketed the difference. Mobilized troops arrived at the front without basic gear because someone had stolen the funds. Families crowdfunded to buy their sons night vision goggles and medical supplies. And anyone who spoke up, silenced, arrested, or disappeared. Then came June 2023, the moment the mask cracked completely. Evgeny Prigozhin, Putin's former chef-turned-warlord, led his Wagner mercenary army in an armed rebellion. Thousands of fighters marched towards Moscow, seizing Rostov-on-Don and shooting down Russian aircraft that tried to stop them. For 36 hours, Russia teetered on the edge of a civil war. Prigozhin accused Defense Minister Shoigu and the generals of treasonous incompetence. He was saying what much of the military probably thought. The war was being lost because Putin's cronies were corrupt and incompetent. Putin called it treason on television. Then suddenly, Prigozhin called it off. But the damage was done. Putin's vertical power had been challenged by his own creation. Thousands of Russian soldiers had stood aside or remained neutral, unsure which side to take. The emperor's clothes were transparent. Even Russia's propaganda machine started showing cracks. Early in the war, state TV confidently predicted swift victory. By 2023, the same talking heads were cautioning that the war would be long and urging Russians to prepare for more sacrifice. Prominent nationalist bloggers began attacking the Kremlin. Igor Girkin, a former intelligence officer who helped ignite the 2014 war in Donbass, wrote in September 2022, "We have already lost, the rest is just a matter of time." This wasn't some liberal dissident, this was a hardline imperialist admitting defeat. The system was eating itself, elites were hedging their bets, trust evaporated, and as the government lost its grip on truth, it also lost its grip on competence. But Putin had already mortgaged something far more valuable in his reputation. Level 5. Economic and demographic suicide. Wars are expensive, long wars are ruinous, and Russia's war became an economic death spiral. To fund the fighting, the Kremlin raided Russia's future. The National Wealth Fund started the war with over $113.5 billion in liquid assets. By December 2025, the liquid portion had collapsed to just $52.6 billion. Russia burned through $60 billion in reserves in less than just 4 years. At the current burn rate, analysts estimate the fund will be empty by late 2026. And when the piggy bank runs dry, Russia faces a choice: print money and trigger hyperinflation, or default. In 2025, Russia's deficit hit 2.6 to 2.7% of GDP. Defense spending devoured over 13 trillion rubles, roughly $146 billion, nearly 40% of the entire budget going to the military. Everything else was squeezed or cut entirely. Russia is paying for today's war by destroying tomorrow's economy. In June 2025, Elvira Nabiullina, Russia's central bank chief, admitted the quiet part out loud at a forum in St. Petersburg. "We used available reserves, labor force, production capacity, capital in the banking system, and funds from the National Welfare Fund. Many of these resources are now truly depleted." Depleted. That's the head of Russia's central bank saying they've run out of options. But the economic damage isn't just about rubles, it's about people. Russia's demographic crisis became catastrophic. Over 1 million casualties, hundreds of thousands dead, most of them young men in their 20s and 30s, the exact demographic Russia needed. This wasn't just soldiers. Between 2022 and 2023, an estimated 800,000 Russians fled the country. Programmers, engineers, scientists, the educated class that could have built Russia's future. Russia lost a generation to war and drove away talent that could rebuild. Birth rates collapsed. With hundreds of thousands of men absent or dead, couples abandoned plans for children. Demographers predict Russia could lose an additional 2 million people by 2030. Russia is replacing its missing citizens with migrant labor from Central Asia, a band-aid that solves nothing. Meanwhile, the money that could have modernized Russia, upgraded hospitals, revamped education, diversified beyond oil, was thrown into a war that has gained Russia a few thousand square kilometers of devastated territory. One Russian economist called it eating the future. That's exactly what it is. Bankrupt and bleeding, Russia had one place left to turn. And that's where things get truly pathetic. Level 6. Becoming China's resource colony. Imperial powers don't become vassals, except when they do. Russia set out to reclaim the empire. Instead, it became a resource colony for Beijing. The transformation was rapid and humiliating. When Western sanctions cut off Russia's primary markets, Moscow had nowhere to turn but east. China saw an opportunity and seized it on China's terms. Russian oil that once sold to Europe at market prices was now dumped to China at massive discounts, $30 to $35 per barrel below global benchmarks. China named its price. Russia had no choice. Natural gas told the same story. China will pay $261 per 1,000 cubic meters in 2025, a 23% discount. By 2027, that discount grows to 29%. European gas prices hover over $400. Russia is selling its resources at a fraction of their worth because it has no leverage. By 2024, 57% of Russia's total imports came from China. More than half of everything Russia buys flows from Chinese factories. Meanwhile, Russia accounts for less than 0.1% of China's import categories. China can walk away tomorrow, Russia can't. Trade between the two countries hit $245 billion in 2024. Sounds impressive until you realize the relationship is completely lopsided. Russia exports raw materials, oil, gas, coal, timber, metals. China exports finished goods, car, machinery, electronics, and consumer products. It's a colonial-era trade pattern, resources for manufacturers. Russia has become the thing it always feared, economically subordinate. Even the financial system reflects this. Over 90% of Russia-China trade is now settled in yuan or rubles, not dollar or euros. Sounds like a partnership, but it's not. Russia has to use yuan because no one else will trade with them. Meanwhile, China controls the yuan, setting the exchange rates and terms. Russia trades in a currency controlled by Beijing. Chinese foreign direct investment in Russia remains tiny, just $10.7 billion in 2023. A microscopic fraction of China's $2.96 trillion in global outward investment. Beijing isn't investing in Russia's future, it's extracting from Russia's present. Politically, the shift is even starker. Putin and Xi Jinping talk about no limits partnership, but watch what happens behind closed doors. Russia stays silent on issues Beijing cares about: the South China Sea, human rights, Taiwan. Moscow doesn't push back on Chinese expansion into Central Asia, historically Russia's backyard. At a 2022 summit, Putin publicly acknowledged that Xi had questions and concerns about the war in Ukraine. Translation: China wasn't exactly pleased, and Russia scrambled to smooth it over. The empire that wanted to dominate its neighbors now answers to one. Russia traded Western dependency for Chinese subordination. Except this time, there's no pretense of equality. Beijing holds all the cards and Moscow knows it. From superpower to client state in 3 years. But there's one betrayal left and it could kill us all. Level 7. Nuclear collapse risk. Russia possesses approximately 5,977 nuclear warheads, the largest stockpile on Earth, and the country controlling them is collapsing. This is the final level of stupidity, the one that threatens not just Russia, but the entire world. Throughout the war, Putin repeatedly rattled the nuclear saber. When announcing the illegal annexation of Ukrainian territory in September 2022, he warned he would use all means to defend Russia, a thinly veiled nuclear threat. These threats were supposed to terrify the West. Instead, they just became noise. Putin cried wolf so many times that the nuclear taboo he relied on began eroding. But here's the real danger. What happens when threats stop being bluffs? If Russia faces decisive defeat, if Putin's regime teeters, does he reach for the nuclear button? A demonstration strike? A battlefield nuke? Western intelligence takes that scenario seriously, even if unlikely, because unlikely isn't impossible. And there's an even darker risk: instability itself. The Wagner mutiny in June 2023 was a warning shot. For 36 hours, Russia's chain of command was under severe stress. Prigozhin's forces were advancing towards Moscow. Some military units stood aside, unsure which side to join. During these chaotic hours, who controlled Russia's nuclear arsenal? Were safeguards functioning? Was the command structure intact? We don't know, and that's terrifying. Russia's nuclear infrastructure depends on secure facilities, trained personnel, reliable early warning systems, and a functioning chain of command. All these require money, expertise, and stability. Russia is bleeding funds, losing skilled workers, and governed by a brittle authoritarian system where loyalty matters more than competence. What happens if the system fractures? If there's a contested succession? If regional commanders break away? If economic collapse triggers unrest? A chaotic Russia with unsecured nuclear weapons is a nightmare that keeps defense planners awake at night. During the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, the United States spent billions through the Nunluga program to help secure Soviet nukes. That worked because there was still a relatively stable Russian state to consolidate them. Today, Russia is more fragile, more personalist, more unstable. And Putin's rhetoric adds another layer of dread. He once mused, "Why do we need such a war if there's no Russia there?" That's not strategic thinking, that's apocalyptical nihilism. It suggests that if Putin faces total defeat, personal, political, military, he might be willing to take everyone down with him, a modern Gotterdammerung. Hopefully, rational advisors would stop him. Hopefully, the system has safeguards. Hopefully, someone would refuse the order. Hopefully. But hope is not a strategy when around 6,000 nuclear warheads are involved. This is the ultimate stupidity. Putin's refusal to accept defeat, his total commitment to a failing war, has pushed a nuclear-armed state towards the edge of internal collapse. And that collapse could trigger catastrophe, not just for Russia, but for the entire planet. 7 levels of stupidity, 7 cascading failures. First came Imperial delusion, the refusal to accept that Russia's power was a hollow shell, that bred the Ukraine gamble, the disastrous invasion that failed within its first week, that failure triggered military self-consumption as Russia threw hundreds of thousands of soldiers and irreplaceable equipment into the meat grinder, as the military crumbled, and so did the system elite breakdown, corruption and paranoia hollowing out any capacity for competence. To sustain the war, Russia committed economic and demographic suicide, draining reserves, driving away talent, and sacrificing an entire generation. Desperate and isolated, Russia became China's resource colony, trading sovereignty for survival. And now, cornered and collapsing, Putin has steered the world towards the nuclear abyss. Each level flowed inevitably from the last. Each mistake compounded the one before, and every decision prioritized delusion over reality, pride over pragmatism, and empire over survival. Russia didn't fall because of NATO. It wasn't defeated by Ukraine, it destroyed itself. What you just witnessed isn't just Russia's collapse, it's a warning. This is what happens when leaders confuse nostalgia for strategy, when they crush truth instead of confronting it, when they sacrifice their nation's future to preserve their own power. Russia gambled everything on a fantasy, and it lost. So what comes next? That's the question hanging over the entire world right now. Does this regime stagger on until its reserves run dry and then the system finally breaks? Does someone inside the Kremlin finally pull the plug before catastrophe strikes? Or does this spiral into something even darker? A fractured nuclear state, a desperate final gamble, or a slow grinding descent into irrelevance? The fall of nations isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just this. One stupid decision after another, each one sealing the fate of millions. And for Russia, there's no coming back from this. Subscribe if you want to see how this disaster unfolds, and let us know in the comments which level of stupidity do you think was the worst, because honestly, it's hard to pick just one.